The Scramble for Africa. During the late 19th century, Africa was being colonized by European nations in an attempt to gain its natural resources. Through these new imperialistic endeavors, the African peoples almost lost all their cultural freedoms under imperial rule. Egypt. In the mid-19th century, Egypt started to work on new projects to make a name for itself to the rest of the world. They built the Suez Canal using British and French funds, and this started Egypt's debt. Once Egypt fell under too much debt, Britain feared losing their investment in the Suez Canal. So to ensure that the Suez Canal remained under British control, they invaded the country. After they invaded, they helped the Egyptians in their economy. The British built a dam on the Nile River and increased their cotton production. But as the British ruled, the Egyptians were taxed and had conflicting ties with the culture of Europeans, such as religious differences. Western Africa. In Western Africa, the French were planning to extend their empire into the interior. With this, they helped to build the railroad system from the upper Senegal River to the upper Niger. Eventually, the French military just took over. Western Africa has always been a flourishing trade region, so the new rulers took advantage of the existing trade routes and placed taxes to make profits. Equatorial Africa. Unlike Western Africa, there were few inhabitants and little trade in this region, but had natural resources like rubber and the area was good for cash crops. Because of this, rather than actually governing the land, European nations opened the region for private companies to take over. The occupation of the Congo Basin was by the actions of Henry Morton Stanley, King Leopold II, and Savarin de Braz. Henry Stanley, explored the region and convinced King Leopold to take control of this area as his own company property. De Braz did the same, but he claimed part of the region for France. Both used and exploited the people and resources of the land. South Africa. This part of Africa was different from the rest because here settlers were already settled here long enough to be known as the Afrikaners, who were descendants from the first settlers living there. This region was popular for its diamond and gold deposits that led the British to invade. The British received much resistance from the natives but soon defeated them. Then they received resistance from the Afrikaners who occupied this region. Soon they too were defeated and the region was annexed by Britain. But like their Australian and New Zealand colonies, they left them to manage their own affairs. Political consequences. With these new imperialistic affairs going on in Africa, Africa suffered from different political consequences. Empires and kingdoms that have been here before the European invasion. Some welcomed and willingly joined, but others resisted and fought the Europeans, like the Ethiopians who, unlike other African states, stayed independent due to their use of European weapons. Social consequences. Even though it seemed as if Africa was putting up large amounts of defenders to fend off the European invaders, a majority of the African population tried to keep to themselves and continued living their lives unaltered. However, this began to become a major issue as the native population began to realize the impeding effects of Europeans. The colonial rule began to disrupt the traditional society in these African civilizations, the property and the land customs being one of the most impacted. Land being used for production purposes tend to remain unaltered other than the harvest tax, but vacant land was offered to private European companies. The Europeans were also very interested in African labor. The Europeans didn't want to cough up the wages to attract workers by normal means, so they imposed the hut tax and head tax. on all Africans regardless of their income. This practically forced them to take up jobs for the Europeans while being paid at nearly 1/10 as much as Europeans. These times were even harder on women who were forced to tend to the family alone as males migrated to cities for better economic opportunities. Also, the women lost more job opportunities as jobs originally thought as women's work were being held for men. Cultural responses. However, this period of time wasn't all bad for Africa. The European presence led to more missionaries and schoolings of the indigenous people. This led to the acquisition of Western ideas, even creating the first African bishop, Samuel Elijah Crowther. The missionaries also led to the spread of Christianity and Islam in Africa, but Islam more so than Christianity because of its pre-existent history in northern and eastern Africa. Fun facts. During the Scramble for Africa, there were only 3 independent nations: Ethiopia, Movar, and Liberia. Between Britain and France, they practically owned about half of the African population. And the exploration of Africa was triggered by the African Association by wealthy Englishmen in an attempt to find the fabled city of Timbuktu. In conclusion, European powers divided Africa. Britain took over Egypt due to debt. King Leopold claimed the Congo. Discovery of gold and diamonds in Ethiopia. Ethiopia defended its independence due to their firearms. African men lost land and left families behind. Africans turned to Christianity to Islam.